Ever feel like, man, life's just one giant bill payment, deadline after deadline, and then bam, unexpected expense.
Ugh, tell me about it.
Like you're just barely keeping your head above water, you know?
Yeah.
Forget about swimming towards any real goals.
Right.
We've all been there. But what if I told you there's actually a term for that feeling?
Oh.
A way to describe that sense of being like trapped by circumstances.
Okay.
Even when those circumstances are sadly so common, so many people are dealing with them.
I'm listening.
Shit life syndrome, SLS for short.
Okay. Interesting.
And I know the name is a little, well, raw,
Yeah.
but it gets to the heart of it, right?
Right.
And, you know, this deep dive, this isn't about wallowing.
Sure.
It's not about negativity.
Right.
It's about understanding.
Okay.
How can something so widespread, so many people are living this, how can it also be so invisible?
Yeah, that's the question.
And more importantly, how do we dismantle it?
Exactly.
Our source today, well, they're not mincing words, let me tell you. Their language, it's as raw as the experience they're describing.
I see.
They call SLS this grinding thing, this chronic state of unhappiness,
Right.
just despair.
Yeah.
And look, this isn't just like a bout of the blues, you know.
Right.
This is deeper. This is about the cumulative impact of, well, you name it.
Okay.
Poverty, unstable housing, no healthcare access.
Yeah. So many people are struggling with this.
And it's that constant pressure, you know.
Exactly.
That never-ending weight that really wears people down.
Our source makes a really crucial point about this. This isn't about blaming individuals.
Okay.
This isn't about, oh, you're just not trying hard enough.
Right.
These are systemic challenges, deep woven into the fabric of how our society works.
It's like the system itself is working against them.
It makes upward mobility feel impossible.
Exactly.
Like you're fighting an uphill battle, but it's an avalanche coming at you.
And that's what makes it so hard to break free.
It's heartbreaking to see that cycle play out, you know?
It really is. Generation after generation.
Yeah.
Our source actually compares it to an inheritance, except it's faded hope that's being passed down.
Wow. That's powerful.
If your parents struggled, you're statistically more likely to struggle too.
Makes you think about how we break that cycle.
So let's unpack the core elements of SLS here.
Okay.
Understanding the problem. That's how we find the solutions.
Makes sense.
First up, chronic adversity.
Okay.
Constant struggle to make ends meet.
Yeah.
That worry becomes a way of life.
It's like being on high alert all the time.
It's exhausting.
Absolutely.
And that's not even getting into the mental energy it takes just to deal with all that day in and day out.
It's true. Leaves very little room for anything else, you know?
Which brings us to element number 2. Hopelessness.
Right.
You've been fighting so long, pouring everything you have into overcoming one hurdle after another.
And yet
The finish line, nowhere in sight.
it's easy to see why people would feel hopeless.
So this feeling starts to creep in. What's the point?
And that's a huge part of SLS. That feeling of being powerless, like nothing you do matters.
That there's no way to change your situation.
Sadly, that often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know?
How so?
When hope dwindles, so does our ability to see a way out.
To seek help.
Exactly.
To believe things could be different.
That's a vicious cycle.
It's like the system itself is designed to make you give up.
We have to remember, though, it's not about individual weakness.
Okay.
This is a human response.
What?
Prolonged stress. Limited options.
It's like trying to run a marathon, but you sprained your ankle at mile 1.
Oof. Yeah. You might push through for a bit.
But eventually.
Your body's going to give out.
And just like that injury, chronic stress, it impacts us physically, mentally.
It becomes embodied.
Our source is very direct about this.
In what way?
They talk about sleep problems.
Right. Makes sense.
Weakened immune system.
Stress does a number on the immune system.
Chronic pain.
Why?
Your body is stuck on high alert, years at a time. It takes a toll.
And those aren't just like imagined symptoms either. Those are real physiological changes.
It's true. It's stress becoming physical.
The body's stress response system is stuck.
It's exhausting. And over time, so damaging.
It's no wonder people in these situations have so many health problems.
Right. It's like their bodies aren't allowed to just recover. They can't get that downtime to repair.
The source talks about sleep specifically, how crucial it is for, well, everything.
I was just thinking about that. Sleep impacts your mood, your immune system, your thinking.
Exactly.
And when you're not sleeping, It impacts everything.
It's a cascade. Poor sleep just makes everything worse.
So it's like on top of the external stressors,
Yeah.
your body can't even cope properly.
It creates a terrible cycle.
Which brings us to a point where that cycle digs in deep. Socially.
Socially.
Our source calls social isolation a silent epidemic.
And they're right to highlight that. It's such an important issue. We are social creatures, you know?
We need connection. It's how we're wired.
Exactly. And it's not just about feeling lonely.
There's a physical impact too.
Isolation. It impacts our physical health in measurable ways.
They even compare it to smoking or obesity.
And those are serious health concerns, right?
It's true. But we don't always think of isolation that way.
Right. Our brains process social isolation as a threat.
So it triggers the stress response.
Exactly. Fight or flight mode, but there's no enemy to fight. It's like your body's always on edge, even when there's nothing to be afraid of.
And it just keeps adding to all those other problems, the stress, the health issues.
It becomes a vicious cycle. SLS can really trap people in this way.
How so?
Well, let's say you're struggling financially.
Right, a common experience with SLS.
It might mean you can't afford to do things with friends.
Going out can get expensive, that's for sure.
Maybe you don't have reliable transportation.
Which isolates you even more, right? You can't just easily get together with people.
And then there's the stigma around mental health.
People are afraid to talk about it, to reach out.
Because they worry about being judged.
It's like all these challenges, they just pile on top of each other.
One feeding into the next.
It's like a maze where every path just leads to a dead end.
It can feel that way, absolutely.
Thankfully, our source, they don't leave us wandering those dead ends forever.
Right. They actually offer some potential ways out of this maze.
There's hope for change.
There is, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
So what are some of those ways out? What can we actually do about this?
Well, they start with a really important point.
Okay, what's that?
We need to address both individual and systemic change.
It's not just one or the other.
Exactly. They're interconnected. Right.
So we can't just tell someone to think positive and expect that to magically solve everything.
Right, because these are systemic issues. It's about recognizing that there are barriers in place that make it harder for some people to get ahead.
It's like giving someone a map and compass when they need a bridge.
I love that analogy. We need to change the environment, create a space where individual resilience can actually make a difference.
So where do we begin? There's so much to untangle here.
The source breaks it down into a few key areas for intervention.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it. What are they?
Access.
Access.
Access to quality healthcare.
Including mental health care, right?
Especially mental health care.
Given everything we've been talking about, that seems crucial.
It is. They also emphasize access to financial support systems, a real safety net for people.
Something that actually helps people get back on their feet.
And access to education, job training.
Tools to help people build a better life.
Exactly. Those are the building blocks right there.
It's about creating a system that supports people, not one that keeps them trapped.
Exactly. Because when you're constantly worried about surviving, about how you're going to pay rent or put food on the table,
there's no mental energy left for anything else.
Right. It's hard to invest in your future when you're just trying to make it through the day.
Our source is spot on about the need for mental health support, especially with all the stress SLS causes. But there's still so much stigma, even now.
Absolutely. People are afraid to talk about it, afraid to ask for help.
Which is why we need that societal change, right? To destigmatize mental health.
To see it as just as important as physical health.
It's okay to not be okay. And asking for help. That takes strength.
It does. And everyone deserves that support, especially when they're facing these kinds of challenges.
Our source also talks about the importance of community.
Absolutely. Because SLS thrives in isolation.
So to combat it, we need stronger communities.
Exactly. Having people you can rely on who understand what you're going through.
That sense of belonging, it's so powerful.
It can make all the difference. Because it's like running a marathon without a cheering section, you know?
It's lonely and demoralizing.
And it feeds right back into that feeling of hopelessness.
So how do we build those stronger communities? Especially in a world that often feels so fragmented.
Our source suggests creating spaces for people to connect. Places where they can share their experiences.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Think community centers. Support groups specifically for people dealing with SLS.
Even online forums, right?
Exactly. Anywhere people can connect with others who understand.
To remind them they're not alone.
Because that sense of isolation, it makes everything harder.
But it's not enough to just have those spaces, right? They have to be accessible.
100%. If someone can't afford the bus fare to get to a support group, it doesn't matter how great that group is.
It's like we talked about before. The solution can't be just as out of reach as the problem.
And that's where policy comes in.
Okay, let's talk policy then. What needs to change at that bigger level, the societal level, to address this?
Well, the source identifies income inequality as a huge factor.
That makes sense. When people are barely scraping by, it's hard to imagine anything else.
We need to look at things like raising the minimum wage.
Making sure it's a living wage so people aren't working multiple jobs and still struggling.
Exactly. Affordable housing is another big one.
And not just temporary housing, but real pathways to home ownership.
Absolutely. We need to address those root causes of poverty. And education plays a role here too.
In what way?
Investing in early childhood education.
Setting kids up for success from the start.
Making college more affordable so it's not just a dream for so many. Lifelong learning opportunities.
It all comes back to empowering people.
Giving them the tools and the knowledge to create a better future. And we can't forget about healthcare.
Right, we talked about mental health, but accessible and affordable healthcare in general is essential.
Our source really emphasizes that because it's hard to break free from SLS when you're constantly worried about medical bills or you can't afford to see a doctor when you need to.
It all ties together. But it feels like such a huge undertaking, changing all these systems.
It is a huge undertaking, but our source reminds us that even within these large systems, individual actions matter.
So we don't have to wait for someone else to fix this.
Exactly. We can be part of the solution. Even small acts of advocacy can have a ripple effect.
Like what? What can people actually do?
Contact your elected officials. Let them know you support policies that address poverty, inequality, access to health care.
Make our voices heard.
Yes. Support organizations that are working to make a difference on the ground.
It's about putting those issues front and center.
Because those small actions, they add up.
We can make a difference.
We can. Our source is optimistic about that. They believe that our voices, collectively, they can be powerful.
That we can change things.
We can shift perspectives, create a world where shit life syndrome, it's not a given anymore.
It's not inevitable.
Right.
So we're not waiting for someone else to save the day. We are part of the solution.
We have more power than we think sometimes.
That's what this deep dive's all about.
Yeah.
If our listeners walk away remembering just one thing,
What would that be?
what's that one key takeaway about shit life syndrome?
It's gotta be this. If we really want to dismantle this thing, we have to go to the root.
Not just putting Band-Aids on the symptoms.
Exactly. We have to build a society where those symptoms don't even appear in the first place.
Where everyone has a real chance to thrive.
That's the goal.
And that takes a huge shift, right?
Huge.
How we think about poverty, inequality, the systems that keep those cycles of disadvantage going.
We have to see each other, every single person, as worthy, regardless of their circumstances.
Because often those circumstances, they're a result of the system itself.
Not because someone isn't trying hard enough.
Right. It's not about blaming individuals.
It's about recognizing how the deck is stacked against them from the very beginning.
And then working to reshuffle that deck.
So everyone has a fair shot, not just at surviving, but at truly living.
As we wrap up here, something our source said really stuck with me.
What's that?
They said that SLS often comes from these long-term stressors and lack of opportunity. Which makes sense, right?
It's the reality for so many.
But what about those who've already internalized that hopelessness?
It's one thing to change policies, create programs,
But then there's that deeper level.
helping people heal from the trauma of those systems.
From being told over and over that they're not good enough.
Rewriting those narratives they've been carrying for so long.
It makes you realize this work goes beyond the numbers, the policies.
Absolutely.
It's about healing, restoring hope, reminding each other we are all worthy of love, support, a chance to create a life that has meaning.
Beautifully said.
The challenges are real, but so is our ability to come together to support each other and make things better.
We can't forget that.
And on that note of hope, I think that's the perfect place to leave our listeners with something to think about.
What's that?
That journey from shit life syndrome to a good life.
Yeah.
It takes more than just external changes, right?
It's internal too.
It's about reclaiming our own stories, believing that a brighter future, it's possible.
For all of us.
That's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep talking about these issues, and let's keep working towards that better world.